Christine, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Kathy. It's so great to be here with you all.
Well, we'd like to ask if, first of all, you'll just give us a little overview on the issue of trade, and maybe start even back with the founders and trade, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Okay, now that sounds great. Thank you. So we have trade is probably a lot more in the news today than it has been in the past, and not for reasons that make most economists very happy. So maybe you all have heard of the U.S.-China trade wars going on, and then now more recently we have a number of trade sanctions and economic and financial sanctions against Russia. But trade has always been a essential part of U.S. domestic and international economic policy. And trade is generally speaking, we can trade goods, we can trade services. We also have flows of capital across borders. We have flows of people across borders. In terms of migration, ideas move across borders, but just strictly in terms of international trade of goods, and then we see the role for government there tends to be in facilitating trade, but then also restricting trade. And you can trace this back to the founding fathers, who saw international commerce as a key. The power to regulate international commerce is a key tool in foreign policy, in terms of statecraft in foreign policy. And really that the power to regulate foreign commerce, they thought, should be exercised with a view to protect the country's interests as well as advance the country's interests. And that's really interesting because that tension there, we definitely see play out over time as we're seeing play out today. And also the thinking, was by securing freedom for cross-border commerce, that the government is able then to promote economic prosperity for everyone in the country, and establishes America's status as a country capable of choosing its own path. And you can trace that all the way to Bretton Woods, the 1944, I think, Conference of Bretton Woods, right after World War II, when countries from all over the world came together and really set the tone for the global trading system as we know it today. And the system is definitely coming up under some cracks today that maybe we'll get to during this conversation. But going back to that Bretton Woods conference, if you go back to the transcripts of Bretton Woods, all countries really came together and on two shared goals. One was they wanted to rebuild from the war, and two, they wanted to make it way too costly to ever go through that again. Now, a number of things came from that. One was floating exchange rate policies and going off gold and all this. But another thing in terms of trade was promoting international trade. So they saw international trade as something that could promote peace and prosperity. So the thinking was that the more that two countries trade with each other, the more pressure that each country's government would be under by their own, private companies and citizens, not to go to war with the other, right? Because, if you and I are if I'm the leader of my country, you're the leader of your country, and we each have, democratic, you each have populations, the more that our populations are trading with each other, the more that it's going to want to be at their interest in terms of us keeping, peaceful relations, right? and they'll definitely want to discourage any hostilities or war, as they would then lose that business. And so in this sense, this is, you may have heard, Woodrow Wilson's, this Wilsonian notion of peace and prosperity going hand in hand, using international trade as a tool for that, that's largely is linked to that. But and then I think, and then it's kind of helpful to go a little back, if I can just jump back a little bit further in time, just going through the key historical moments of U.S. trade policy. It was really in the 1930s. Well, really before the 1930s, U.S. trade policy really fluctuated between trade promoting and trade restricting, right? So some policies were really trying to promote trade, finding new markets for U.S. exports, and then also welcoming in imports as well. And then other practices were more about trade restricting. So you may have read about the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that the Tariff Act of 1930, that significantly raised average duties on imports, upward to 60%. So a tariff is a tax on imports, or sometimes called a duty. And it's, so if, let's say I'm an importer in the US and I'm buying a widget from abroad, if it's $100 and the tariff is 10%, then I have to pay $110, right? So thinking of tax as a sort of an ad valorem tax. And a tariff is a tax on imports. It is paid by the importer. And there have been empirical studies on who bears the burden of that tax. And the overwhelmingly empirical evidence shows that it's the importer themselves that bear the burden. So when the US puts a tariff on its imports, it's US importers. In other words, US businesses that are importing and US consumers that are importing, we're the ones paying that higher price, right? So, and that is a big myth of tariffs. A lot of people think that we're punishing our trade partners by imposing tariffs on what we buy from them, but in fact, we're really just punishing ourselves because we're just paying higher prices. So, then, anyway, the Smoot-Hawley tariff really raised tariffs to all-time highs, and that led to, or contributed to, this downward spiral, of course. Then fast forward to about 1934 or so, and we have the Trade Act of, a really historical Trade Act, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. That really marked a turning point in modern trade legislation. And it was a real departure from the protectionist policies that came right before that. And that was a big moment in US trade policy to not only lower our tariffs, but also send a signal to our trading partners that we were interested in more engagement, more trade, more imports, more exports, and that it gave Congress the power to negotiate downward tariffs in exchange for lower tariffs from our trading partners. So in other words, I'll lower my tariffs if you lower yours, right? And so that was an effort to try to get to a lower tariff across the board. And there have been multiple large agreements, multilateral agreements, in that spirit, really ever since. But it was a so-called bargaining tariff that that Act of 34 implemented, and it worked really well. But then what happened over time is the Congress, with Congress having the power to set tariffs, they started getting knocks on their door from this industry, that industry, that industry. Our industry is really special. We need import protection, and here's a really important case to be made for putting a tariff on these imports, right? And so while those tariffs might help that particular industry, because now they don't have to compete with, it basically reduces the competition they face. The rest of the country has to pay higher prices, right? And so over time, what the government realized is they realized that it was actually better off for the entire company to put the trade negotiation powers with a special negotiator, a special trade representative. And so Congress agreed to have a special trade representative negotiate tariffs on behalf of the entire country, right? And this was a way for sort of Congress kind of saved them from themselves, right? Because Congress knew that they would be vulnerable to all those knocks on the door, because they want to get reelected, and if they can help, particular company in their district, they will. And so, but they also realized that, going down that spiral is not a good place for the US, and we could end up back with high tariffs. Not to mention, it disincentivizes our trade partners to lower their tariffs. So here comes this special trade representative, and they're supposed to negotiate on behalf of the entire country. And that worked really well. And it really has worked well, at least up until recently, with what is now called the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and the USTR, and they negotiate U.S. trade policy on behalf of the administration, with Congress's blessing. And then usually Congress will vote up or down on any major legislation. Although recently Congress has wanted to get more and more involved, which can be good, but it's not always good. And we can talk about that, or maybe you guys will have questions about that. But there always is this trade-off between politicians that are under pressure from special interests to put tariffs on, versus their duty to the broader public for a more open, prosperous country. And vast pieces of history show that countries that are more open to trade also tend to exhibit higher income levels and greater economic growth. So so what we're having now is this these tensions with China have arisen, and Congress and USTR find themselves under a lot of pressure to reimpose tariffs, and now the policymakers, as well as really the American public, need to figure out which way to go from there. So I think I'll leave it there, and then I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Well, thank you. And that is fascinating how the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep came into being. I never knew that, but it does make a lot of sense. I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about trade deficits in our country, because I believe I was reading that we just recently had the largest trade deficit yet in a record trade deficit in U.S. history. And how does that affect our country? First of all, when we have a trade deficit, what exactly does that mean? And then does that weaken us, in your opinion? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. So the trade deficit is, or the trade balance, right, is basically just the difference between the value of our exports and the value of our imports. Sometimes we have a trade surplus, sometimes we have a trade deficit. Some countries tend to run deficits, some countries tend to run surpluses, some countries go back and forth. The US has, for a long time now, had a trade deficit, which just means the value of our imports exceed the value of our exports. And so it's a real, a commonly misunderstood metric. Trade policy has nothing to do with our trade balance. Our trade balance is really driven by fundamental saving and investment rates, right? So you have to think of, like, the only reason you want to export is so you can import, right? That's the only, we don't export because we just love working and making stuff for the world. we export so we can, so we can consume more ourselves. We have, and the fact that we import more than we export reflects the low saving rate that the U.S. has, and the fact that the U.S. economy is very attractive for investment, both domestic and foreign. So while we do have a trade deficit, we actually have a capital account surplus. So for those of you who continue with economics, and maybe you even have learned this already, there is the current account balance, and then there's the capital account balance. The current account balance is basically our trade balance, but our capital account balance is the balance of capital going and money going back in and out of the US. And we have a capital account surplus. That is, we attract a lot more dollars into the US than we put out there. And that has worked well for us because other countries are big savers. The US is not a really big saver. We're a big consumer, but we're also a pretty safe haven for investors. Obviously, the dollar is the global reserve currency. And our growth rate has pretty been strong and steady for decades. So we're a good bet when it comes for foreign investors. And we attract a lot of foreign investment, a lot of capital. And so that means that, we have a lot of extra, and foreign investment there, if you will, and it comes out on the other side. So if you have a capital account surplus, you tend to have a goods trade deficit.
That's very interesting. I've never thought of the trade deficit in that way. Well, I know Tova's got some great questions. And so Tova, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for breaking down this whole issue. It's, very fascinating. So I was wondering if you could talk about kind of the difference between the idea of free trade and the idea of fair trade. Because I know, like, at least in my city, that's been kind of a big issue. Like, even at my school, there's a club called Fair Trade Club where they promote like fair trade practices, and we have like big organizations for that. So I was wondering if you could break down like the idea of free trade versus fair trade. And then if you kind of consider fair trade to be like in the same bucket as tariffs, and that it is like introduces inefficiencies, or if you think it's something different.
A really good question, Tova. So free trade is a term that basically describes trade that is unencumbered by tariffs or any other policies that will distort prices at the border. So tariffs or import quotas or subsidies or other import restrictions, or even policies that promote exports in a excessive way. So just free trade, right? So in other words, I'm selling widgets, and anybody who wants to buy them, whether they're my next door neighbor or somebody across the world can, and I want to buy that kind of widget, and I can buy it from whoever I want, right? So that's free trade. Fair trade is a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I don't know if there is one definition of fair trade, sort of a loaded term. Economists sort of roll their eyes at fair trade because it means different things to different people, but it usually means protectionism to most economists, and especially in trade policy in Washington, D.C. So, and what's fair to one group may not be fair to another group. So for instance, think of the steel tariffs that the last administration imposed. Well, the steel industry may think that's fair, right? But what about all the manufacturers that buy steel that need it to make things here at home? Now they have to pay a higher price for steel, and they have to compete with other manufacturers around the world that are not paying that tariff, right? So it's sure not fair to them, right? So be careful when you're using the term fair trade. It really means different things to different people. And for instance, in the coffee world, right? Starbucks uses fair trade, that term, to describe, farmers who are paid a fair wage. And then, so if consumers are interested in buying products that, under particular characteristics, then the best way to do that is just to offer more transparency across the supply chain and let the consumer know what they're getting. But to call it fair trade is, I think, is a misnomer.
Thank you. That helps clarify a bit, or I guess clarify it less, which makes it a more accurate understanding in this instance. But I was wondering, I guess in the same vein as fair trade, I guess I'm guessing the students at my school who are in fair trade club aren't like advocating, tariffs or anything. I think they're more in the Starbucks lane where it's like ethically produced, like less of an environmental impact. So I was wondering how you think that factors into the way trade is conducted between countries, if kind of like ethical or human rights should be prioritized, and environmental impact, and how that might be done without compromising, our economic efficiency.
Right. Well, consumers have increasingly expressed desire for goods that are not made with forced labor, for goods that are made with by people who are paid a living wage, and when consumers have those preferences, then the companies that do a better job in transparency across their supply chain. And nowadays, you can go to Starbucks and sometimes you can even see a video of the people working in the bean fields, right, of the coffee beans, picking the beans that from the farm that go into your cup. So that's just a consumer preference, of a share of American consumers that and the companies that want to cater to that, do, and they can sometimes charge a premium for that too, right? Sometimes consumers will pay more for the knowledge that their good was, made under particular conditions and not other particular conditions. So, yeah, I think that's more driven by consumer preferences, than anything. And Starbucks is happy to do it because that's what their consumers want, and that's what their consumers will pay for.
Thank you. And then I kind of want to talk about the thing that I think is on a lot of people's minds, sanctions, right? You see with the escalating crisis with Russia, like overnight, a lot of the world is kind of putting sanctions on Russia, which has kind of changed like the nature of trade for sure with Russia and with many other countries. So can you talk about the idea behind sanctions and, in your opinion, how effective are they really? Who do they target? And kind of what the situation with that is.
Yeah, that's a really good question about the effectiveness. I was talking to the former chief economist at the State Department a few weeks ago, and I asked her about this, Sharon Brown-Briskin, and she said, a lot of policymakers want to slam dunk on sanctions, right? But that isn't always realistic. And so for instance, but what can be achievable is making it more costly for the unwanted act to continue, if you will, right? And we can see this playing out right now with Russia. A lot of people are asking, are our sanctions really effective because Putin is still attacking Ukraine? And the thing is, sanctions alone may or may not ever change a particular country's or a different leader's behavior, but they can definitely incentivize some behavior and disincentivize other behavior. And at the very least, they can make it more costly to do what the person is still doing, right? And so the land grab in Ukraine, will sanctions stop Putin? I have no idea. So far, they have not, but it definitely is signaling that he's not going to get it for free, right? So there are different types of sanctions. Actually, there was a big grain embargo back in 1980 that the U.S. did against Russia about Afghanistan, and that was just simply, saying, well, we're not going to sell U.S. grain to Russia anymore, to punish them for the Afghanistan invasion, and that was largely deemed ineffective. One, because Russia just went and bought grain from other sources, and meanwhile, U.S. farmers were really upset. And they lost huge amount of sales, and again, it didn't change Russia's behavior. But over the years, policymakers have learned to target their sanctions. And that's what we saw in 2014 with Crimea. The EU-US sanctions against Russia were much more effective at targeting particular individuals, entities, companies, oligarchs, agencies that were facilitating the Crimea invasion. And but that takes a lot of intelligence, right? And so you've got to, you have to have access to the right intelligence to be able to identify all those different people and entities involved in moving capital and goods and services for the invasion, and then try to cut off those ties. That's what we're seeing really the entire West come together right now and orchestrate. And it is really amazing at how, in a way, Putin has brought the West together that, in a way that we haven't really seen since the early 90s. So will they be effective? Again, how do we define effective? If you define effective as making it really costly and painful for Putin, then yes, it does appear that they will be effective. But in terms of changing behavior, that's another issue.
I see. Thank you. And then just staying on the idea of sanctions, it seems to me like government sanctions have been around for a really long time, but I don't know if this is unique or not, but I know a lot of companies, like private companies and individuals, have kind of come together to, like Apple Pay or whatever, to stop operations in Russia, or like McDonald's. So I was wondering, I guess you would consider that a boycott, not sanctions, since it's not coming from a government, but like how common is that on like a global scale to have so many private companies deciding to kind of pull out of a country? And how do like the aims of private companies imposing boycotts like kind of differ from governments imposing sanctions? And does it have the same kind of effects?
So they're definitely intertwined, right? So we have seen a lot of companies halt operations, or as you say, just really, pull out of Russia. And when they're asked why, I mean, they cite sanctions, and whether or not they're immediately and directly affected by the sanctions, they're afraid of getting caught up in the legality and the cost of getting caught up in the sanctions, right? And there also is a reputational risk, right? So, could McDonald's stay in Russia? I don't know. I mean, maybe, but definitely the supply chains are going to get more difficult, right? Because just of all the financial sanctions that Russia is experiencing. So they are basically, getting really limited in terms of what they can, in terms of how they can use their dollars. Even, their ruble. Meanwhile, the ruble is in free fall. The entire country, the economy is also going, in free fall. And so there's the legality of the sanctions, there's the supply chain issues, there's the instability, and there is this reputational risk, right? As the West, as the population of Western countries sees what's happening, with social media these days, no CEO wants to be at front in mind of leading a company doing a bad thing, or being seen as facilitating a country that is doing a bad thing.
Great, thank you. And then my last question is about, there's been a very big movement to encourage products to be made in America. You see all those stickers, made in America. People take that as like a point of pride and importance when making decisions. So I guess, could you talk about like your opinion of that movement about making things in America? What might prevent companies from making things in America? And why do you think people feel, so strongly that they should buy things that are made in their country?
That's a great question. And there has been a lot of, a lot of countries go through these ebbs and flows of nationalism and feeling of national pride. And sometimes, made in America in the US is part of that. But I mean, just look at, just pick up your smartphone. I mean, mine says designed in California, assembled in China, right? if you look at all the different pieces of your iPhone or really any smartphone, all the different stages of production, from research, design, innovations, to intermediate component production, to marketing and sales, and you break down and assembly, right, and then sales, and break down each, who has the dominance in each of those stages and where the real money is. The 80% of all the profits go toward the highly knowledge intensive parts of production, right? That's the R&D, the marketing, the sales, and the design. Very small, it's like less than 5% of those revenues go toward the assembly. Well, all the assembly is done in China. I mean, if we were to really bring the assembly back to the US, well, first of all, we have a major labor shortage in the US, so it's not clear we have enough workers to do it. But the cost of your iPhone would be, at least, 5, 10 times as much. You would be paying thousands of dollars for an iPhone instead of hundreds. And what do we get from it? I mean, just the ability to assemble it. Why? And so this goes back to comparative advantage, right? And so comparative advantage is one of those terms in economics that, for those of you who stick with economics, or hopefully you already have been exposed to it, but it's basically, if China has a comparative advantage in assembly, right? The US has a comparative advantage in design and R&D. So it's easier for us to do the design and R&D. We don't have to give up as much. And it's easier for China to do the assembly, right? They don't have to give up as much. If we have to do the assembly also, then we're gonna be doing less of the R&D, right? A country would rather be at its production possibility frontier, doing the highest value activities that it can. So for the US, it makes sense for us to focus on the higher value added and let other countries do the assembly. And you can just take that example and multiply it really across anything. It doesn't always make sense for everything to be made in America. I like to say, think of selling America. Forget about buying, made in America, but think of selling America. 95% of the world's consumers are outside of our borders. That's what we should be focusing on: opening markets abroad and strengthening trade ties.
Great, thank you so much. That was very thorough. And I will pass on my questions to Jewel and Jordan.
Thank you, Tova.
Hello, how are you?
Hi.
It's been a great show so far. And I think it's a good tie-in from where Tova left off about tariffs and about where things are made. So we have talked to a bunch of economists, and we talk about the Constitution and what's allowed and all of that great stuff, and the relationship between the two. Big fan of the pencil example from Milton Friedman about how amazing it is that all of these components come from around the world to make a pencil. And it really is remarkable, and it's efficient, and it even though there are complaints about where oftentimes the standards in other countries of labor they're bad standards, but there's no proof that it would be helpful for us not to be helpful for those people if they didn't have that opportunity, because oftentimes that's the only one that they do have. But my question is more so back in America. There's been a lot of factors that have led to us making so much overseas, and a lot of it is not economic. So if you think about like oil, well, we could be a net exporter of oil, but we're not, and it's only because of regulation. That's obviously Russia's biggest export, and it's where the world is they can't do too much, as we're all seeing the results of what's going on in Russia. We're all paying for it, because a big part of it is because America's not a net export of oil when we could be. So as far as tariffs and their relationship to that, it's not just free market that is creating these prices. Does an economist, how much does an economist get into the territory of trying to calculate the cost of regulation?
So that is an area of of work by many economists, right? And so for any regulation that is proposed, the Office of Management and Budget, along with the respective agency, does a cost-benefit analysis, right? And so yes, so economists do a lot of those cost-benefit analyses in terms of, but trade. But what you're talking about is more of a domestic policy issue, right? But you also point out that, rightly so, that domestic policies can affect trade, right? So if we have something that we could export, but we're not because of some regulation or that's restricting production, well then, yeah, that is also going to restrict our ability to export it. But in terms of who works on that, those are domestic economic policy analysts and economists doing that cost-benefit analysis.
So it's like the government has their finger on both ends of the scale, because on one end, they're in ways creating the environment domestically for the things to be exported, but then there's a movement to then put tariffs on what's coming back in. And for the voting population, that's why I think there's been a shift for that. Oftentimes those in who were total free trade don't put tariffs on anything. Many of those same political minded people are now more in favor of tariffs. And I kind of can understand how that would happen or why. There's such a reduced amount of labor positions in. There's a labor shortage, but there's also a total different way of entering the labor force in America today than there was 20, 30, 40 years ago when my dad was coming up. And corporate America is different. What do you see? What would you see next as far as fast forward 20 years? Do you think that we are further down, America has less production and more, like you were saying, we have even more of the what you said was the top 80% of bringing in of capital, like the marketing, R&D, the management positions? Do you think we'll have even less production and even more management, or do you think that we've reached the critical mass of that and it'll start to even out with technology, or what do you think is next?
Yeah, look, I mean, I have no idea what the future holds, but you just go back 20 years ago. I remember when there was this big study by Forrester Research, and they predicted that like 45% of jobs would be wiped out because of robotics and trade, and they predicted this huge unemployment rate, and and here we are today, right, with the trade as a share of GDP at nearly an all-time high, and yet we have a severe labor shortage, right? So but the thing is, and I think you're getting to this, is that workers today are doing different things than workers yesterday, right? And you can just look at the list of occupations by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and compare the list of occupations today to 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. Some of those jobs no longer exist. And then there are a number of occupations that are on the occupation list today that were not on there 25, 50 years ago, right? So this is a process of creative destruction that maybe you've heard about, right? Joseph Schumpeter. And, progress is always messy, right? Progress has always been messy. It will always be messy. And there are winners and losers. In other words, not everyone is affected the same exact way by technology or by trade. But does that mean we should shut down trade? Does that mean we should shut down technology? Right? I mean, there's that famous saying that, capitalism is awful, but the only thing is that all the other approaches are way, way worse, right? So progress is messy, and we start, and we continue innovating. And we're going to continue to innovate ourselves out of a job, right? And there's going to be new jobs that we don't even know about. And our grandparents may have made widgets, but our grandkids may be making software or fill in the blank, right? So just because you're not making something tangible doesn't mean it's not of value. the US economy, as many other OECD economies today, are largely services driven, right? So a lot of the value added activities that US workers do are in the services sector. That means that something tangible doesn't necessarily come out at the end, but it is a service that somebody either here or abroad is willing to pay for. And so we have, in fact, the US has a trade surplus in services for what it's worth. But, and so, we often do get mistakenly focused on goods trade, but really we should just be focused on overall, overall well-being, per capita income, quality of life, living standards. And you can see that in the US has been going up steadily, over time. So, and you can also see that living standards in countries that have been more closed to trade have not been rising as quickly as they have in countries that have been more open to trade. So while being open to trade and innovative and open to technology is not always a smooth ride, it's always, it shows that living standards, unambiguously are better off for it overall.
Could you ever cite an example where a tariff was net positive for the importer?
You mean for the importing country?
Yeah.
Well, in theory, a large open economy that has some market power, their optimal tariff is not necessarily zero. It's usually something small but positive, because the larger your country is, the more market power you have. And so by having a bit of a tariff on, you can keep demand down just a little bit. And so by keeping demand down a little bit, you're changing your terms of trade. So your relative import price is going down a bit. But that's in theory. In practice, we don't really see any evidence of this. Like even in the U.S. Steel tariff example, there have been a number of really great empirical pieces coming out of the Fed that look at the effect of those steel tariffs, because you would think, well, the U.S. is a big country, we should have gained something from those steel tariffs, right? But even in steel, the U.S. is not the steel market. The U.S. is not large enough to be a big price setter, and so even on those steel tariffs, we had deteriorating terms of trade. So that is
not even. So as we can't even that there's not really even one hard example to like that's positive for them. It's funny. I mean, I knew that overall.
Makes people feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, you guys.
So for American-based industries that decide to manufacture overseas, they didn't start overseas, but they've moved overseas. What are the trade tariffs on them? Are they the same as just an overseas company? Do they fall within a different line because they were first established here?
Oh, well, they don't get any special treatment. Any import, so the US has a tariff schedule, and so there's literally thousands of different products, and every product has its own tariff. But the US has pretty low tariffs. I mean, the average tariff is about 2 or 3% in the US. There are some tariff peaks out there. They tend to be on textile, apparel, footwear, leather products, some ag, but overall the US is a pretty low tariff. Where we do have the tariff peaks, they are there, but it doesn't matter, who's doing the importing. If you're importing and you're in the US, if there's a tariff, you have to pay the tariff, right? Sometimes we have free trade agreements with other countries. And if we're importing, a t-shirt from China, we might see an 18% tariff, but if we're importing a t-shirt from Australia, it would be tariff free because we have a free trade agreement with Australia.
So once you make that move, it's just like you've always been there and you're doing what everyone else does.
Yeah.
Doing what everyone else does. Okay. And you had touched on earlier our tariffs and trade now and how you kind of seem like you're going to get into a drastic difference. And I wasn't sure if you got to explain everything you were thinking of at that time. I'm just curious what you were going to get into.
Well, I was going to talk a little bit about the China tariffs because, so the World Trade Organization, came out of the Uruguay round in the mid 90s. And that's when, hundreds of countries around the world got together and agreed to lower their tariffs, and then also agreed to be members of the World Trade Organization. And basically, every country said, look, they negotiated down tariffs, and then they said, okay, we're going to lock ourselves into these low tariffs. And we agree, and we're going to lock ourselves into these rules, right? And the rules are basically, you've got to keep your market open. You can't treat imported goods differently than you treat domestically produced goods. And if you do something for one trade partner, you've got to do it for everybody else, okay? But then over the years, there has been this building anxiety about trade, especially after China came into the World Trade Organization. And the last administration, the Trump administration, imposed steel and aluminum tariffs across the board in a unilateral fashion, which by all accounts is not compliant with our WTO commitments. And they also imposed tariffs on a very large share of China imports. Also, questionably, most legal experts would question whether that is really WTO compliant or not. And then China has retaliated. Many other countries have retaliated for the steel aluminum. So now we're starting to see, countries are starting to draw outside the lines, right? We used to have this very nice lines of, everyone had to stay inside, right? The WTO rules. But now countries are starting to go outside of those rules and they retaliate against each other. And we are seeing more tariffs and more trade restrictions today than I have ever seen in my lifetime. And we don't have a functioning dispute settlement mechanism in the World Trade Organization anymore. And so there's not even recourse. And so it's a real big question mark on where this is going to end. Will countries get back together and realize they really do want a functioning World Trade Organization and recommit to that? Or are we just going through a period where countries have to work some things out for themselves? How they're going to deal with China, how they're going to deal with carbon issues, carbon border adjustment issues. There are a number of other issues that unfortunately countries do not feel that the WTO is equipped to handle. And so I think that's probably going to be the next big issue that lawyers and policymakers and economists grapple with over the next 5 to 10 years is how to rewrite these trade rules in a way where we can all get back to trading with one another in an aim for peace and prosperity.
All right, I think it's time for some audience questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jewel and Jordan and Tova. Y'all had great questions as usual. We do have some audience questions here. First of all, Professor Klinger wants to go back to the U.S. trade rep question. I believe he says, I'm concerned about the level of power that the president has gained to impose trade sanctions. The Constitution gives Congress the power to impose taxes, including tariffs, but doesn't Section 301 effectively empower the president the power to impose taxes? Isn't that an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer, I'm only an economist, but yes, there is a big question mark on that. Many legal scholars have brought up this point. And yeah, I mean, in a way, it's very clearly, it is in Congress's authority to do that, and they are letting the president get away with doing that. I mean, if Congress wanted to, they could take back those powers tomorrow. They could take off the tariff tomorrow. Legally, they could undo that 301 and even the 232. But they are, I think, very few members of Congress are willing to usurp the executive privilege on that at this time.
That's a really good point. That often, it seems Congress does willingly give up power when they could they could take it back. And then Robert Casimiro goes back to the trade deficits for a second and has an interesting angle on it. He writes, we've been having trade deficits almost continuously for many decades. This means money going out of the country or staying here and buying up assets here in the United States. What effect has this foreign investment had on the political, cultural, social life here and our sense of national unity?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a question for the American public. I mean, just look at, I would ask you, just look at how you've spent your money over the past week, right? Or what trade balance do you have with your grocery store or Starbucks? I mean, I know I'm in a trade deficit with my Starbucks and my grocery store. I'm in a trade surplus with my employer, but I'm in a trade deficit with Starbucks and the grocery store. So and then you just start putting borders across this, right? So again, a trade deficit is really a reflection of a country's saving rate relative to its investment. And for countries that don't want to save very much and are also very attractive to investors, they will naturally have a trade deficit. And the opposite is true for other countries. China, they have historically had a much higher saving rate than the U.S. has, and they're not a really big consumer-driven economy like the U.S. is. They have a trade surplus, but they have a capital account deficit. So they sell a lot to us, but they also buy a lot of our dollars, right? A lot of treasury securities. So that we'll see whether and to what extent that continues. But the trade deficit is really just a reflection of our saving investment balance.
Now, one thing that we noticed when we were doing a little research for the show and looked at some of the headlines was that China's export growth, which it's still growing, but it had slowed in January and February. Do you know if there's any simple explanation for that? And is that a sign of anything?
Well, I've assigned a few things at least. China's population is aging, starting to age. They remember their demographics with their one-child policy for so many years is really starting to catch up with them. So their population is not growing as quickly as it used to, and their incomes are also growing, and so they don't necessarily have that major comparative advantage in low-skilled labor intensive goods like they used to. I mean, they still have it compared to most other countries, but the gap isn't as wide, right? So so while it still makes a lot of sense to locate a number of different activities in China, the gap is diminishing. And in terms of the slowdown in growth, the demographics largely are a big factor in that. And and then countries do experience ups and downs. I mean, they are probably, many think, on the cusp of a major financial crisis with real estate. They've really been putting a lot of money into assets, that were not necessarily based on market decisions, right? So whenever you get a lot of money going to a particular sector because the government wants it to go there, you always run the risk of crisis.
Well, and also speaking of China, we all know that they're watching with great interest what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and it does seem like that countries have come together really in an unprecedented way to support Ukraine and to impose sanctions on Russia. Do you think that fear of economic retaliation from the rest of the world could slow China's plans down towards Taiwan? I mean, do you think that'll be, how big of a factor do you think that is in their thinking?
We'll have to wait and see. People, China watchers are saying that, China is watching this very closely because China, is much more integrated into the world economy than Russia, right? And so for China to, if such economic and financial sanctions were made against China, the repercussions for China would be much more severe than it's playing out for Russia.
Well, thank you so much. This has just been such a really fascinating show, Dr. McDaniel. I think we all learned a lot about trade deficits and the trading history of our country. And we really appreciate your time. I want to go to Tova and Jewel and Jorn and see if there's any last comments y'all want to make.
I think I'm good, but I really appreciate your time. And I really learned so much. It's good to be able to put some context behind the headlines. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tova, and thank you for all your great questions. And how do you say it? Is it Jorn and Jewel? Thank you guys so much.
Yes.
And Tova, your questions, I mean, are so great. I just really enjoyed it, and I love talking to you guys. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for a great show.
Well, and thank you to all the audience. And we want to invite you back next week for the last in our American economy series. And we're going to be talking about cryptocurrency. And specifically, we're going to have someone who knows a great deal about Bitcoin on. Brandon Vandeford, who is a professor at University of Texas at Arlington in economics, and also a member of our Constituting America Governing Board. So we're really excited to have Brandon talking to us next week about crypto and about Bitcoin. So we hope y'all will all come back and spread the word. And thank you again, Christine, so much.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.